All right, this is Pastor Matt, and we are working on The Mortification of Sin by John Owen. We are in chapter 2, and last time we read the first point. I'm going to read the second point. I'm actually going to try to read points 2, 3, and 4 in this reading, and the next week 5 and 6. 6 is a longer point. So I'm going to read 2, 3, and 4 to you, and I think that you're going to find there's some very helpful things in this next section. All right. At least some encouraging things. And I say that because there's times where I thought, especially when I first became a Christian, I thought, oh man, there must be something wrong with me that I'm feeling this way or thinking this way or tempted a certain way. I just thought God would just, in his freeing me from sin, would take all those things away. And I think John Owen is really dealing with what we actually work through and actually what the Bible teaches about those things. So, but without further chat, I want to jump into chapter 2. This is part 2, and I'm starting off at point 2. So, number 2, sin not only abides in us, but it still acts, still labors to bring out the deeds of the flesh. When sin lets us alone, we may let sin alone, but sin is never less quiet than when it seems most quiet. Its waters are deepest when they are still. So we need to vigorously root out sin at all times and in all conditions, even where we least suspect it. Sin not only stays in us, but the law of the members of the body is still rebelling against the law of the mind. And the spirit that dwells in us tends to envy. Sin is always at work. The flesh opposes the spirit. Lust is still tempting and conceiving sin. In every moral action, sin inclines towards evil, or it hinders good, or it disengages the spirit from communion with God. It inclines to evil. Quote, "The evil I do not want to do, that is just what I do," says the apostle. Why is that? Because nothing good lives in me, that is in my flesh, from verse 18, and sin hinders me from doing good. Again, quote, verse 19, "The good that I want to do, I do not do." In the same way, either I do not do it or I do not do it as I should. All of my holy things are being defiled by this sin. The flesh lusts against the spirit so that I cannot do the things I want to do. Sin distracts our spirit, and so it is called the sin that so easily entangles us. That is why the apostle has such grievous complaints about it in Romans 7. For those of you that are listening to the podcast, it might be helpful if you were to watch the video as well, or maybe watch the video later, or have a copy of this, because I'm failing to say in every single point where it's a quote, but almost half of his words, I would say more than that, 2/3 or 3/4 of his words are in quotes, and there's footnotes there from the scriptures where they come from. And so I'm not pointing all those things out, but if you're following along with the video, you may see that these things that John Owen is saying about the flesh and how we deal with it are things that are directly from Scripture and from the Apostle Paul's writing. So sin is always acting, always conceiving, always seducing and tempting. Who can say that he ever had anything to do with God or for God? That indwelling sin did not have a hand in corrupting. And sin will have this impact more or less all our life. If sin is always acting and we are not always mortifying, then we are lost creatures. Oh man, that's a good. Get my pen here. If sin is always acting and we are not always mortifying, then we are lost creatures. If a man stands still and allows his enemies to beat him without resistance, then he will undoubtedly be conquered. If sin is subtle, watchful, strong, and always at work in the business of killing our souls, and we are slothful, negligent, and foolish in trying to ruin its efforts, then how can we expect a good outcome? There is not a day that goes by that sin either foils or is foiled, that it either wins or loses, and it will be this way all the while we live in this world. I will release anyone from this duty that can make sin surrender, that can bring a cessation of arms in this warfare. If sin will spare him one day, even one duty, assuming he is acquainted with the spirituality of obedience and the subtlety of sin, he may say to his soul, "Take the day off in this duty." The saints long for deliverance from sin's bewildering rebellion. They know that the only safety against it is constant warfare. That's the end of point 2. Wow. Point 3. Sin not only troubles us, but if left alone, it produces soul-destroying sins. Sin not only strives, acts, rebels, troubles, and it disturbs us, but if it is left alone, if it is not continually mortified, it will produce great, cursed, scandalous, soul-destroying sins. The apostle tells us what the works and the fruits of sin are. Quote, "The works of the flesh are apparent: adultery, fornication, uncleanness, lasciviousness, idolatry, witchcraft, hatred, variance, jealousy, anger, strife, sedition, heresies, envy, murders, drunkenness, carousing, etc." You know what it did in David and many others. Sin always aims at the extreme. If it had its way, every time it rises up to tempt or entice, it would go out to the most extreme sin of that kind. If it could, every unclean thought or glance would become adultery. Every covetous desire would become oppression. If it were allowed its own reign, every thought of unbelief would become atheism. Men may reach a point where sin is so unrestrained that it no longer stings their conscience. The most outrageous sin no longer seems scandalous. If every impulse of lust were satisfied, it would reach the height of villainy. Sin is like the grave that is never satisfied. So true. I believe that's a quote from, or an allusion to a proverb. This is part of the deceitfulness of sin, which hardens men's hearts and leads to their ruin. It is subtle in its initial approach, and so we succumb to it. But once it has a hold on our heart by these little concessions, it gains a footing, and then it presses on in increasing degrees of the same kind. This continual pressing forward fools the soul into thinking the separation from God that has already happened is insignificant. It thinks that if there is no further progress, then nothing is different. To the extent the soul is made insensitive to a sin, that is, insensitive to what the gospel requires of the believer, that is the extent to which the heart is hardened. But sin still presses forward. That is because the only boundary it has is our complete relinquishment of God and our opposition to Him. Its ability to proceed towards this extreme end by degrees and to make good the ground it has gotten by hardness does not come from its nature, but from its deceitfulness. Nothing can prevent this infiltration but mortification. Mortification will wither the root of the sin and strike at its head every hour, so that whatever it aims at, it is thwarted. If the best saint in the world shirks this duty, he will fall into as many cursed sins as anyone else. Okay, I was planning on reading 2, 3, and 4, but both of those, that's profound. I may have to, when I'm done, go back and reread these again. Again, this warfare that we are in with sin and the mortifying duty of it. I read these and I'm motivated to continue this work, to look for any ground that sin may have conquered that I have not fought back on. I thought that was an interesting point. Well, I hope that this reading of the mortification of sin has been beneficial to you. It looks like I may have to stretch chapter 2 out into more than just 3 parts. and that's to be expected. This book is a small book, but I have a feeling it's going to take me a while to work through this because it's so rich in gospel-focused words, but it's just saturated with Scripture. I'm just amazed at how much it's almost completely Scripture oriented in every word. Every part of it goes back to some aspect of something that John Owen has obviously picked up from the words of God himself. Well, again, hope this was helpful, and feel free to reach out with any questions. Thank you for listening.